Hello and welcome back to the channel. It's that time of year on BookTube, folks, where we're wrapping up our 2023 reading years. So today I'm here to tell you about the books that stuck out to me, that stayed with me throughout 2023. Books that, as I'm talking about them, if they sound interesting to you, I would highly recommend picking them up. If you're new here, hi, my name is Lillian. I really enjoy talking about books, writing, and creativity, and the art and craft of storytelling. And if you end up enjoying today's video, I hope that you subscribe and stick around. I'd love to have you. If you're interested in hearing about my favorite graphic novels from 2023, I am making a separate video talking about those. And once that is live, I will put that video up in the cards and in the description for you to go and check out. The order of books that I'm talking about is more so chronological than any sort of ranking going on. As I was making my notes, it just sort of happened about that I ended up going chronologically with things. So that's what we have in store for today, and let's go ahead and get on into it. The first book that I picked up and finished in 2023, oh boy, was it a doozy, and that is Bonjour Tristesse by Fancois Sagan. So this book originally came out in 1954 when Fancois Sagan was about 17 or 18 years old, which, let me tell you, is devastating for anyone who wants to be any kind of published writer at any point in their life, because this book is incredible. Which is not to say that I don't have my critiques of it, which we'll get into in a moment here. But as far as a nuanced character study examining the tipping point between childhood and adulthood and the sharp cruelty of youth, chef's kiss. We follow our main character, 17-year-old Cecile, and her single father, Raymond, as they are taking a vacation during the summer on the French Riviera. For years, Cecile and Raymond have sort of coexisted in this bohemian, bacheloresque, sort of freewheeling lifestyle. However, that gets called into question when Raymond, her father, announces that he intends to get married and settle down, with the introduction of this new stepmother that wants to establish a more traditional structured family lifestyle. Cecile sees her impending loss of freedom and a deep change in the relationship with her father, who is one of her best friends, on the horizon. And so she ends up rebelling against this impending marriage and setting into motion the tragic events of this story. This book is gorgeously written, like infuriatingly so. It's narrated for the most part inside the head of Cecile, who is a young, precocious, and somewhat nihilistic young woman. I think that Sagan did a really good job of capturing the heady mindset of being a teenager on the brink of adulthood, where you're desperately clinging for certain things to stay the same, all the while longing for the social agency to craft the life that you want around you. My critiques of this book mainly stem from a modern understanding of feminism. The gender dynamics in this book are definitely very binary and patriarchal. Cecile and her stepmother both play on sort of the prevailing mindset of the time that men will be men and the women in their lives will have to be manipulative and underhanded in order to get something that they want. Plus the idea that men simply can't help themselves when it comes to women are just animals and we have to put up with it. For the time, it was certainly a book that pushed boundaries, with Cecile as a heroine who rejects conventional notions of romance, marriage, and responsibility, and instead chooses her own sexual freedom, was definitely seen as scandalous. Aside from my modern critiques of this book, I still really enjoyed it overall, and it's definitely stuck with me throughout the year, so if it sounds at all interesting to you, I'd highly recommend picking it up. Next up is a book that I was not expecting to blow my socks off, but has now become one of my favorite classics that I've read so far, and that is The Awakening by Kate Chopin. This was originally published in 1899 and caused quite a stir, and was mostly condemned for its depiction of marital infidelity. To give a quick summary of this book, if you aren't aware, we follow the story of Edna Pontellier, a 28-year-old married woman and mother of 2 young children, who is struggling to achieve a sense of personal and sexual emancipation in the oppressive social atmosphere of the postbellum American South. This story is gorgeously written and has several reoccurring symbols and allegories that run throughout the book that I felt were just really well done. I was honestly struck at the number of sentiments explored in this narrative that still ring true for discussions that we're having in the modern day about motherhood and patriarchal standards for women. Edna is battling against the societal standards of the 1890s when it comes to things like her own bodily autonomy as a woman, and especially as a wife, her ability to pursue and create a life for herself that's based on her own passions, and her ability to choose whether or not she wants to be a mother. I really adored this book and definitely plan on coming back and rereading it at some point in the near future. The next book is actually one that I read immediately after I read The Awakening and didn't think it would have any sort of thematic connection, but oh boy. And that is, this book is not about Benedict Cumberbatch, The Joy of Loving Something. Anything Like Your Life Depends on It by Tabitha Carvan. Carvan? I'll admit, I initially picked up this book from the library sort of on a whim, on a lark, and thought it would be a bit of a laugh as someone who is very much into the whole BBC Sherlock craze of the 2010s on Tumblr. However, I didn't realize that this book was going to end up being akin to a cathartic sucker punch. As the title suggests, this book isn't about Benedict Cumberbatch, although it does relate the author's experience in developing a fangirl obsession with the actor and the BBC Sherlock show. At its heart, it's really an exploration of the shame that women and girls often have or develop around being a fan of something, being openly enthusiastic about something. This book asks the question of what happens when we simply decide to follow our interests like we used to, unabashedly, audaciously, and shamelessly. This book definitely touched a part of me that I hadn't realized that I'd buried out of shame, and it's gotten me to think about how I can let go of shame when it comes to things that I'm truly passionate about, but I felt like I've had to minimize in the company of others. This next book I can definitely give credit to sparking my recent interest and fascination with memoir, and that is Just Kids by Patti Smith. This is a memoir of Patti Smith's time in New York City during the 1960s and 70s, relating her deep and lasting friendship with fellow artist Robert Mapplethorpe and how the two looked out and provided for each other in those early hungry years as young artists. The memoir itself is a really intimate portrait of Patti Smith as a young artist, but also as a backdrop of New York City during a very vibrant, chaotic, and interesting time period in history. I loved listening to the audiobook of this memoir, which Patti Smith herself narrates. I also got my hands on a physical copy, which I know I will be rereading at some point in the future here. It was a very interesting read, but also a very thought-provoking read for me personally as someone who wants to make her way as a writer, as a creative. Apologies for the change in the lighting. My camera ran out of battery, so I had to pause for a little bit to charge that, but I forgot where I was, so let's start at the beginning of the book that I was talking about. I don't think anyone is surprised that this next book is on my favorites of 2023, and that is No One Is Talking About This by Patricia Lockwood. I feel like I haven't shut up about this book since I read it earlier in 2023. For those of you who haven't heard me ramble about it, I'll try to give a brief synopsis here, with the caveat that I don't think that this book is going to be a crowd pleaser. I don't think that everyone will enjoy it. If you aren't immersed or familiar with internet culture from the past 10-15 years or so, I think a good chunk of this book is going to go over your head. It's also written in a very experimental sort of stream of consciousness format. So with that being said, I think this book and its experimental format do a phenomenal job of depicting and exploring the ephemeral, chaotic nature of social media and how over time that environment can mold and shape how we interact with things in our lives, interact with different experiences like hardship and grief. The format itself is a very sort of experimental stream of consciousness vibe while being riddled with internet jokes and absurdisms, which I just got a kick out of. Like I said, I don't think this book is going to be for everyone, but if you do identify someone who is or has been chronically online and would like to read something that kind of explores that, I would highly recommend this book. And I will be picking up my own copy of this book when my Know by Year is over. Next up, I would be remiss if I didn't talk about the Books of Bayern, a series by Shannon Hale. I'll try to keep this brief since I did just recently talk about them in my recent 5-star reads video. This is a young adult fantasy series from the early 2000s that was very similar to a lot of the books that I was devouring during that time period of my life. Think Ella Enchanted by Gail Carson Levine, or pretty much anything that Tamora Pierce was writing at the time. Each book in the series follows a different protagonist in the world where a group of friends are working together to establish a peaceful kingdom, fighting for what they believe in, in and looking out for and protecting each other. Each protagonist has their own unique character arc where they come into their own, step into their power, and learn how to recognize and use their strengths to help others. I really adored the audiobook experience of this series. It is narrated by a full voice cast of actors, and my overall experience with this series was just wonderfully nostalgic, even though it wasn't a book series that I read in my early teen years like the others were. But in so many ways, it felt like I was coming home to a younger version of myself. If you're someone that prefers to look up content warnings before reading something, I would recommend looking up some content warnings for this series. If you're a big fan of 90s and early 2000s young adult fantasy, I would highly recommend this series. Next up is a fantasy novella that I devoured a few months ago, and that is The Black Tides of Heaven by Neon Yang. This is the first in their Tensorit series. We're following the parallel paths of Makoya and Akeya, royal twins with magical powers born to a ruthless, power-hungry empress. All children in this world are born non-binary and eventually choose a gender when they feel ready, which is honestly a really cool concept, which for the twins is where their paths start to diverge. I don't want to give too much of the plot of this book away. However, in broad strokes, the story is about inequality and power and, of course, magic. I appreciated the number of typical givens that this book's narrative chucks away, particularly gender, Eurocentrism, and patriarchy. All of it felt properly original, engaging, refreshing. I really enjoyed this first book, and I'm definitely looking to pick up the rest of the series in 2024. Another book that I recently mentioned in my recent 5-star reads, so again, I'll try to keep this brief, that is Lavinia by Ursula K. Le Guin. Le Guin is more so famous for her sci-fi and fantasy books, but I believe this might be her only historical fiction book. Le Guin fans, please correct me if I'm wrong, but Lavinia is her take on the wife of Aeneas from the epic poem The Aeneid, who in the actual text only gets a handful of cursory mentions and doesn't have any actual lines of her own. I adored this book. I think Le Guin does character study so beautifully, and this book is no exception. One of my favorite aspects of this book is that Le Guin was writing from a notably antiquated perspective, by which I mean Lavinia as a character was steeped in the wants, desires, and motivations of someone in her position during the time that she would have lived if she was a real person. She hadn't been modernized for a modern day readership, while also at the same time feeling like such a realistic and tangible person, which I'll credit to Le Guin's incredible ability to write and portray fully fleshed out characters. You can tell that Le Guin not only did tons of research in order to be able to write this book, but that she had enough grasp on the time period and the original text, the Aeneid itself, to really examine and play with aspects and themes in a very expert way. One of the key themes in Lavinia and throughout a lot of ancient literature is this concept of fate and a character grappling with fate. Virgil himself is actually somewhat of a character in this book, although he's not named specifically. He's simply called the poet. He appears in several visions to Lavinia when she goes to speak with a local oracle for guidance. And so Lavinia is aware in some regards as to how her life is supposed to play out, that she will meet and marry Aeneas and will only have a few years of marriage with him and have one child before he is tragically killed, but that the legacy that she will help him build will eventually found a very large empire. I thought that the interactions between Lavinia and the poet were a very wonderful, magical, sort of very meta aspect of this book, and I think Le Guin did it in a very thoughtful and wonderful way. I actually ended up giving a few copies of this book to people for Christmas. That's how much I loved it, and I will be picking up a copy for myself in 2024 for sure. That is it, folks. We have made it to the end of my favorite books of 2023 video. Let me know what your favorite books were from this past year, any that you would recommend that I check out. If you're interested in hearing about my reading goals for the coming year of 2024, I'll have a video coming out about that next week, so stay tuned. But until then, I hope you all are staying well, and I look forward to seeing you in the next video. Bye.